Good to all the parliamentary committee members. Like many people around the world, when the pandemic began, who felt like we were walking through a dystopic world in a blindfold. There was no leadership in the community for at least a month. We were vulnerable to outside community members coming in to buy marijuana or cigarettes. And it took a while for the emergency response unit to actually declare a pandemic on March 23rd. My apologies to the translators. I realize I have 5 minutes and not enough time. The fact that the businesses in Kanesatake and in Kahnawake have been vilified and ostracized by colonial entities made it more problematic, and we felt even more vulnerable at the start of this pandemic. As you may know, we live in a community that has 3 centuries of fighting for our rights to our homelands being ignored, and when you have no rights in a pandemic, this does not improve the situation of fear or uncertainty and of more land dispossession. This problematic perspective, of course, is rooted in institutionalized and societal racism, which devalues Indigenous peoples' lives, which have been subjugated by colonizations and its impacts. As the declaration of a pandemic was declared by Prime Minister Trudeau, Indigenous peoples were still in the throes of the Wet'suwet'en protests, anti-pipeline protests, Indigenous rights, and the pandemic suppressed this movement. And we understand why, because of the health precautions. The construction workers and police remained occupied on Wet'suwet'en lands, and they continued in spite of an MOU with the traditional hereditary chiefs. And so in Kanesatake, we were trying to deal with economics before rights. We have an elders home that was shut down when the pandemic was declared, so we have no cases there. I should clarify that the community I come from, Kanesatake, was also the Oka crisis, and I heard one of the previous speakers mentioned Oka Park, and that's where I'm coming from. There was a meeting that was made up mostly of local Mohawk merchants, and because we were told to stay home in COVID-19, nobody knew about this, in spite of people like Teresa Tams telling everybody to stay home. But even so, even in spite of my hesitancy, I do agree with the checkpoints that were put up. There is a preconceived notion, and we are a community villainized by the media and the government. And there remains a fallacy that we are lawless. And so public attitudes dictate that no laws apply to our community, even during a pandemic. So we had youth from spring break coming to our community as if this was their playground. The pandemic has caused us to be more vulnerable inside our checkpoints. Many human rights abuses were committed and harassed. The people at the checkpoints were harassed even by the SQ, by a doctor and the mayor of Oka. These are outlined in my written submission. And as Indigenous people, we are shut out and silenced by the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Relations, Carolyn Bennett. She silences the voices of the traditional government. This is too big an issue to discuss at this parliamentary committee, but on a daily basis, we feel vulnerable, especially when land dispossession is continuing because construction has been allowed while everybody is told to stay home and self-isolate. We do not have a voice, and I think it's safe to say that we suffer from chronic fatigue of institutionalized racism. As Indigenous peoples, we have been made to feel as we are dispensable throughout our lives by a settler society that has not come to the realization that our rights are human rights. We are peoples with the right to self-determination, but Canada still exerts colonial oppression, stalling any progress that could be made if they upheld the various international human rights norms that they are signatories to. Instead, we are placated with engagement sessions that benefit the colonizers' dispossession of our inherent rights. This year on July 11th in 2020 marks the 30th anniversary of the siege of Kanesatake and Kahnawake, which you know as the Oka crisis. It is a time of awakening and a 3 centuries long dispute by Ganyakahaga of Kanesatake. The Rudinuseshaga people have been excluded. As we witness in the US and the international outrage of Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd, We see once again the heavy toll that institutionalized racism has taken. Canada has had plenty of opportunities to make the sorely needed changes now. It's time for reconciliation and reparations, pandemic or not. Economic self-interest has been the root of colonization, the free market capitalist, and the global economy. As the first peoples of Turtle Island, we are never given the respect for our rights on a daily basis, and more so in a pandemic. And in the protests and the blockades will continue. The teachings of our ancestors tell us that there can be no peace in an atmosphere of fear. There can be no justice when we fight every day for the respect of our fundamental human rights. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. And